So we'll start jumping into some technical content. First part is going to be sort of our perspective on how HPC I/O works and what sort of things you need to be aware of if you're trying to make it go fast. So when we talk about a HPC I/O system, it's not just the hard drives that you're storing your data on. It's a pretty relatively complex environment. So we'll talk about the hardware and the software. The hardware is not just the disk, but the servers and the network that you use to get to those servers. And we'll go into more detail on these things a little bit later. And the software environment's pretty deep too. There's the file systems, and then we usually expect that applications are going to be using a set of libraries to help them access the file system more efficiently. And we categorize the kinds of I/O that we usually see applications doing into one of two categories. So defensive I/O just means checkpointing your application because you think something might crash, either your app or the system, and you just want to store the state so that you can recover it later. And the second category is productive I/O. So this is actually storing your results, things that you intend to analyze later. So actually getting science done with your storage access. And a lot of times these are combined for to try and save doing the same thing twice. But you see different strategies in how people do the I/O depending on what their goal is. If you're doing defensive I/O, it's not really something you want to do, it's something you have to do, so you're trying to just get it done as quickly as possible and get it out of the way. If you're trying to do productive I/O, then maybe it's more important to get the data in a format that you can access later. So that changes your strategy a little bit. And the fundamental problem that you'll kind of see as a recurring theme as Rob and I are talking this morning is that at the application level, you probably have almost certainly have a data model that's based on your science domain. So you may have multiple variables, multidimensional arrays, adaptive meshes, image formats, all sorts of things that you're working with that's based on your science and based on the computation that you need to do. Unfortunately, disk drives don't have that. They have bytes, right? They have blocks and bytes. And when you look at the API that you get for a file system, you have files and directories, and each file has a sequence of bytes in it. So there has to be some mapping to get from the way you're representing your data in your applications to how we can actually store it in the storage system. And there's a lot of data. So this chart's actually pretty old. This is 3 years ago from our last generation machine at Argonne. But this is just to give you an example of what users told us they were going to be doing with their data on the system. And you can see from the chart there that the online data refers to the data that they're going to actually have on the file system that they can access anytime they want. The offline data is basically on tape. And even 3 years ago, we were already having hundreds of terabytes of online data per project. And I'm sure it's much higher than that now already. And then this is sort of how much storage needs to be set aside for your project on the system. How much do you expect to just kind of keep there? But if you look at how much data is actually moved on and off of the file system, it's a lot bigger. This is more recent data from a few months ago that we just took a sampling of applications and looked at how much data they were reading and writing. And there's a couple things you can see here. There's a lot of different science domains that are making heavy use of the storage system, and they're moving petabytes of data over a series of months. Now they're not holding that much on the storage system at any one time, so they're obviously deleting things, rotating data in and out and so forth, but they're moving a lot of data. And from my perspective as someone who works on storage systems, it's interesting to see how much data is being read, because we think about writing data as being the critical problem in HPC I/O, and there is a lot of writing, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people are reading in data sets to do their science too. So this is perhaps no surprise to you guys, but it was a little bit surprising to us. So if we look at going back to kind of revisiting the software and hardware kind of points of view of how data moves in the system, we've got two stacks shown here. So this is kind of a high level, what's going on in terms of conceptually with your data and what's going on as the data transits the storage system. So of course there's the application that's trying to get data to the I/O hardware. You have an application data model, that's your your multidimensional arrays and meshes and so forth. There's some transformations to turn that into something the storage system can handle, ultimately going down to the file system data model. And as far as how the hardware goes, you're going from memory on the compute node through a network to your actual storage devices. That's just kind of a high-level look at it. Now, what does this actually translate into? That's the conceptual model, but how does this actually get done? Now, in past years, systems were a little bit simpler than they are now, and what we expected to see was that people would have their own hand-coded mechanism for mapping their data models into a file. You're going to be writing things into normal, Unix or POSIX files. And the storage system wasn't all that complicated either. You probably had an Ethernet switch connecting your compute nodes to your servers, and there's likely to be a RAID array, some large collection of disks on each server. And that was sort of the picture of what was going on. Things have changed a little bit, especially as you scale up to the types of systems that we have at Argonne and the other DOE labs. So there's a little more complexity going on both in the software and on the hardware. Hopefully you don't have to do so much of the data translation yourself. We have a lot of libraries that you'll be hearing about today that can help you kind of organize different scientific data formats and help you do the right thing in terms of how to transform them into a good layout for the storage system. And then on the storage side, we'll have a diagram of this later, but it's not just going over the network from a compute node to a server. There's a few more hops in here. We're talking about systems that have their own high-performance internal network, a Taurus or a Dragonfly network that the data has to get over first. There's going to be some gateway nodes that get from your dense collection of compute nodes out to the storage system, which is likely separated a little bit. And then you get to your same sort of I/O servers that you had before, but probably with a lot more disk on them. The major platforms at the DOE labs now will have 5,000 or more disk drives that are there to store data. So the system's more complicated. Does this mean your application's more complicated? No, hopefully not. In fact, we hope that things are getting a little bit easier in some sense because so many libraries have kind of emerged to help you with the data transformations. But there is a lot more going on here to be aware of, and a lot of today is just going to be to kind of give you a taste of what's going on in the system, what works well, what doesn't, so that you can be aware of why you might be getting good I/O performance or why you might not be getting good I/O performance. So we've talked about mapping application data models onto storage, and you want to do this efficiently so that you don't spend your time waiting for I/O to happen. And the things that you might do to make I/O go fast are sometimes at odds with what you might want to do to make your data be formatted well for analysis. And so this is sort of the research problem. How do we get both? Or how do we know when to skew things one way or the other? So that's sort of our jumping off point for what we'll be talking about. And I guess just a little bit to set expectations. I don't know how many people in the audience have been working on this type of system already or are coming from a different type of system, but when you log on to, say, Mira at Argonne, you have a file system just like you would on any Linux machine, and it has files and directories. It looks the same. But aside from just the surface appearance, it's actually quite a bit different from most other file systems that you'll have on a smaller scale or on a workstation. So it has tremendously more bandwidth. So we talk about bandwidth in hundreds of gigabytes per second, if not thousands of gigabytes per second. And your application has to do I/O in parallel to get those kind of numbers. But it's not faster all around. It's faster bandwidth, but much worse latency than your disk on a typical workstation. So, optimizing for a big parallel file system is all about moving data in bulk in parallel as best you can, and try to avoid doing little operations to your files and directories because the latency is just not going to be as good as you're hoping probably. And we'll see in the diagram, there's a lot in between your compute node and the data, so it takes a little while to get there from a latency point of view. So a little bit about how this stuff works. The fundamental building block for an HPC storage system is the parallel file system. So it provides a consistent view of all your files and directories from all the login nodes and all the compute nodes that you have, so that all the applications see the same thing. And the important thing is, and I mentioned earlier, there's many thousands of hard drives that are providing the storage for this. So the big goal of the parallel file system and the ecosystem built around it is how do we organize data. So you see one file system, and it has to be using the resources of a lot of servers and a lot of disk drives. And so we're going to talk about how this data is organized, how data moves there, and what are some things that you can do to make it go faster. When you get to the parallel file system level, there's going to be multiple servers. It's not just one server like an NFS server that you would access. And you have many clients, of course. You're writing big applications. So the key to getting the performance out of it is accessing in parallel. So having each of your compute nodes contribute some of the I/O, or at least a big portion of your compute nodes doing that, so that you can use multiple servers at the same time. If you funnel all of your I/O to a single point, to a single process, you're just not going to get much out of the kind of storage system here, because you won't be able to leverage all of the servers. So when you go to read and write data, these are the applications along the top row here. And each one has a little bit of software linked into it, or in the operating system on the compute node, that tells it how to access the file system. And the data goes over interconnection network, goes to a set of parallel file servers. There's it could be anywhere from 32 to a few hundred file servers, depending on the HPC system you're working on. And then each of those servers has some local disk arrays attached to it, which is where the bytes ultimately end up. And that's sort of the idealized, you have a lot of clients, you have a lot of servers, there's a network connecting them, that's it. In practice, when you get to the leadership scale systems, we have to put another layer into the system to make it all work, and that's the I/O forwarding layer here. So that's the purple boxes here. So we have the same things that I just talked about in the previous slide. There's still storage nodes with their disks. There's an external network. But the compute nodes, there's so many of them. We're in an era now where there's hundreds of thousands of compute nodes, and frankly, it doesn't work very well for 100,000 compute nodes or 1 million compute nodes to access the same file system all at once. First of all, we can't package that many network connections into the compute nodes, and secondly, it probably overwhelm the file system with the sort of the scale that it's dealing with. So there's this interposition layer, the forwarding nodes, and all the I/O gets funneled down to a set of forwarding nodes, and then from there it transitions out to the file system. And that's a point where some optimizations are made to try and kind of corral the data into a little bit better format for the storage system, and it funnels the network connections down to a kind of a manageable level. So this is a fact of life on big machines now. All of them have this forwarding layer in some form or another. Now, as a result of having, if you can count the lines here on this diagram, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 hops to get from a compute node to an actual disk drive. So that means it takes a little while to bounce back and forth. There's a lot of bandwidth, but it takes a little bit to traverse it for a small operation. So if there's nothing else from today's presentation, the thing to learn from that is that you will get more bandwidth if you do larger I/O operations. Of course, it's not always possible. It depends on what your data model is, but if you have the choice of doing 1,000 4 kilobyte operations or doing one 4 megabyte operation, the 4 megabyte operation is going to be vastly faster. The graph on the left is showing this trend on our last generation system, and we're at kind of the plot's at kind of a relatively small scale. It's going from 4 kilobytes up to 4 megabytes. And you can see that at 4 kilobytes, you're only getting a tiny fraction of the bandwidth that you can get to the storage system. And by the time you ramp up into multiple megabytes, you're sort of in the sweet spot and are getting a lot more bandwidth potential. Things are even a little bit more extreme on other systems. So this is from the Mira system at Argonne. And we're at a different scale, so we still ramp up through up to 4 megabytes. Well, Mira has a quirk that we can see that once you get to 16 megabytes, you get another big jump. So, you know, this is system dependent, how big is big enough, right? But you at least want to be in the megabytes range if you can help it, and certainly try to avoid things that are under 100 kilobytes if you can help it. Another thing I should point out on this graph that's a little funny looking, this has these weird spikes at each point. So this test, Rob actually ran this test and collected the numbers. Tries some sizes that aren't precisely on a kilobyte boundary, so there's some powers of 10 numbers instead of powers of 2 numbers in there. And that's showing you that there's a lot of deviation right around the kind of alignment size that you would expect on a computer. So if you have the opportunity to do things that are page aligned or at least power of 2 aligned, you're going to get a little bit more out of the storage system too. So, as mentioned earlier, that what the parallel file system needs to do is find out how to distribute your data across a lot of servers so that you can use leverage them all at once. It doesn't help us too much if a given file is all put on one server because all the other ones will be idle. So this is sort of a picture of what it looks like. So in your file, this is an example checkpoint file. From your application's point of view, it's just a contiguous set of bytes. And there's probably some metadata associated with it inside the system that tells it how to organize that. But the parallel file system will break that apart on some boundaries so that part of your file is on one server, part of your file is on the next server, and so forth. So that as a whole, if your application is writing to this file concurrently, maybe each process is writing to a different portion of it, then you're going to use all of the servers at the same time, and that's going to get you the best performance. Now, on today's systems, the storage system is the one who picks where the data goes. You don't really get to control that. So basically what you're going to be doing is trusting that if you do big I/O, it's going to take care of splitting it up. And the key thing is just to kind of present that data in a way that the storage system can deal with it. Now, going back up to the application level, this example is showing parallel net CDF, which Rob will be talking about more later. But what happens is you have, in this case, there's 2 variables. One of them is a 3D and one of them is a 2D. And you're going to express them in a way that is a little more sensible in that regard. You can say how many dimensions there are, what your starting offset is, what the units are, things like that. And the library for parallel net CDF in this case is going to lay that out as a sequence of bytes for the storage system. So it tries to organize this in a way that's sensible. There's a header that's all in one place that contains the metadata you need. And then there's big chunks of data that are going to map from multiple dimensions, multiple variables into a flat stream of bytes to present to the file system. Now to give it some examples of what pieces of software might make up parts of your software stack, just to give some names here. The things that handle your data models are going to be HDF5, parallel net CDF, Audios. There's others out there as well, like Silo or PIO. The transformations are usually done those pieces do some transformations, but we expect the heavy lifting to be done in a middleware layer, which includes things like MPI/IO. So that's the I/O function calls in the MPI standard. There's other things like Glean and PLFS that we'll talk about a little bit. And then we go through that I/O forwarding layer that I showed on the architectural diagrams earlier. The I/O forwarding layer is going to be provided by the vendor usually. So on Blue Gene systems, we have the IBM CIOD doing this. On Craze, you have DVS or possibly a Lustre network forwarding system. And then the parallel file system at the bottom, again, is usually vendor provided. We have GPFS on Mira, Lustre on a lot of other systems, and there's other options out there. So how do we get performance out of all this? So the first thing, well, maybe the second thing. The first thing is do big I/O if you can, but the second thing is to think about how the storage system protects data that's striped across multiple servers. So the issue is you have a lot of clients. They don't know how data is broken up, probably, and they may concurrently try to access the same block on a server. What this means on most file systems is that the file system uses locking to protect those blocks to make sure that two clients don't collide and make an incoherent result from modifying a block. And the locks are on some boundary. Call them a block. It's determined by the file system. You don't get to pick it. But the important thing is that this lock unit, and we're talking about something on the order of a megabyte or 4 megabytes, if you access things exactly on that lock boundary, it's going to go faster. Because if you have something that spans a lock boundary, like this green block here, it hits part of 2 and all of 1, it's going to be locking 3 blocks, and while that's going on, even operations that don't conflict, that would hit this little piece here, this little piece here are going to be stuck because it's just a coarse grain kind of lock, serialized, let one person at a time modify that block. So the optimizations that the middleware and data model libraries are doing are often trying to avoid this problem, trying to organize things so that you don't hit this. So, and this just gives another example, and there's some things to keep in mind that might not be obvious. You can organize your data so that it's in nice big chunks, nice powers of 2. You're hitting the lock boundaries exactly right so that the file system isn't having to work too hard to avoid contention. Everything's good. Then you work on your data model a little more and you decide you need a little header, just a little bit of information at the front of your file to describe the data. Well, if you don't align that part, then that one little bit, a few kilobytes, is going to slightly offset the rest of your data in the file. And all of a sudden, you have what was a really nice pattern is going to become quite a bit harder for the file system. So that's just something to keep in mind that little changes, even in just a header file, can sort of throw this off and might affect your performance more than you would expect. So what does the storage system do to help you with this? Ultimately, in your data model library, you're going to express what you want to have happen, and it's the goal of the system software to try and transform that, aggregate it, do what it can to line things up so you avoid lock boundaries. You're doing operations in big chunks to the storage system. And most of these transformations are going to be transparent. You don't have to do a whole lot to get them, as long as you're just using an API that in sort of a reasonable way.
Excuse me?
Yes?
How do you find out what is the lock boundary size?
Do you know? You want to know how big? How do you find out what the lock boundary size is? Is that going to be from?
Well, the short answer is don't worry about it. Let the IO library do it. But the IO library finds out by looking at stat. Stat gives one of the fields in stat is a block size, and hopefully, whoever wrote the parallel file system implements that so that the block size reported by stat is the best way to access the file system. Sometimes that's wrong, but that's the best you can do is look at stat.
Yeah. And if you do that on your laptop, you'll probably see a block size of 512 or maybe 4 kilobytes. But if you do that on a Lustre or GPFS volume, you're going to get a number back like a megabyte or 4 megabytes probably. It's going to be a different scale. So there's different kinds of transforms that can be done. One of the most important is to just avoid, try to limit the number of operations that get to the storage system, and there's several ways to do that you'll hear about. One thing, this is an automatic optimization that MPI-IO will do when it identifies the opportunity to do so, but it's called data sieving. And data sieving is a little non-intuitive. The reason is this, and this is what your application is trying to do. There's some disjoint blocks or chunks of data that you're trying to write. They're not necessarily aligned, and they're possibly quite small. So the obvious way to put this on the storage system is to send a separate operation for each of these. But this is going to create a flurry of traffic on the storage system. Maybe these things aren't aligned very well. You might hit the lock boundary problem. So one way to avoid this, and this diagram is showing a write, is for the storage libraries to read in the entire file, or at least a significant piece of it, do a modify in memory in your system memory and in your system network to replace just the things that are going to change, and then write the entire chunk with the changes and the old data back to the storage system. So this looks a little weird because you're doing a lot more I/O than you actually needed to, but the point in this case is that that's actually faster, because even though you're doing more I/O, you're doing it in a small number of operations, and you've got a lot of bandwidth at your disposal in these systems. So this kind of optimization sounds funny, but actually it can help quite a bit. And I'll show an example later of what it can do for you. The other thing is avoiding lock contention, so the libraries can do this for you too. If you do a collective write with MPIO or netcdf or HDF, what will happen is, even though you're expressing a lot, possibly many small write operations, it's fine if they're small if you're doing collectives, they will get aggregated by the library, by the system software, into big chunks somewhere in the system, probably on one of your compute processes, and then those big chunks will get written to the file system all at once. So the stack of software in the system will, for you, combine these things into bigger pieces so that you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. And there's just a little bit more detail here. I'm not going to walk through all of this, but the kind of the important thing to keep in mind is that, especially on systems at the DOE labs, these libraries have been optimized. They already know what the block size is in the file system. They know where the lock boundaries are. They know how many servers they are, and they're going to organize the data to accommodate that. So this is just an application example to show you what's the scale of improvement that you get by using these optimizations. So this particular example, some of you may know about this application already, is S3D. It's a turbulent combustion code, and its data model has a couple of three-dimensional arrays, a couple of four-dimensional arrays, some subarrays, and you can make some pretty pictures. Don't ask me to explain them, but there's sort of an idea of what the volumes might look like. And there's different backends that S3D can use for writing its data, one of which is parallel netcdf, which is nice because it organizes the data in sort of a very structured way that some other tools can interact with easier later. But if you use parallel netcdf, it's going to automatically pick the right method to get the data to the file system. But we can use hints to force it into a different mode. In this case, we forced it into some bad modes just to see how bad can it get if you're not using these optimizations. But hopefully it's picking the right mode, but you can change it if not. So this example is some statistics that we collected from just a small run with 16 processes. And the first column over here shows basically with no optimizations. What you express for parallel netcdf to do is what gets pushed down to the file system. And the application, just with 16 processes, did 100,000 writes. Practically all of them were unaligned. And it's a very small piece of data, just 6 megabytes is all it was trying to get to the file system. But to get that 6 megabytes out took 1,400 seconds. And the compute time was 3 seconds. So that's terrible, right? You don't want to be in that zone. So the next optimization that you can use is the data saving that I talked about earlier, where data is read from the file system, pieces of it are modified, and then the whole thing is written back out. And you can see here that if you look at the total amount of data that gets seen by the storage system, it's much larger, an order of magnitude bigger, but the runtime has gone down by 100 times. So now you're only spending 4 seconds doing the I/O on 16 processes and 3 seconds doing your computations. So that's much better. In this particular case, the default mode is going to be using collective buffering. So what does that turn into? The application, in all these cases, the application is trying to write 102,000 different things. But with collective buffering, the libraries condense that down into just 5 big chunks. They get written to the storage system. Very few of them are unaligned. And it writes exactly the right amount of data. and it takes 0.6 seconds. So this is what these libraries are doing for you by kind of organizing the data. So you want to be trying to use tools that can do this for you, so that you don't have to work too hard to get this kind of optimization, but it's a massive difference. So the transformations that I just talked about are done sort of in this.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
You said that was peanut CDF, and the first was just peanut CDF if you just use it?
No, the third column is actually what you would get normally.
That's normal.
Yeah, just to illustrate the point, we forced it to do the wrong thing. So
If I use peanut CDF, I don't have to do anything funny to get that.
Yep, and Rob will be talking more about peanut CDF later if there's particular things you need to do from an API point of view, because there's good and bad ways to use peanut CDF, but if you're using the right hooks in the peanut CDF, you'll automatically get this third column.
How do we collect those statistics?
So this will be the later afternoon session. There's a tool called Darshan, and it's available on Mira and a lot of other systems, and it will collect this kind of data for you. So we'll show some. It doesn't necessarily just come out as raw tables like this. You can get some graphs and things of what your application is doing. And these transformations that I was just talking about are all happening here in this big blue box, which is where your compute nodes are. But we've got some other points in the stack here where we could transform things, and the I/O forwarding layers is sort of a key one here. So that, as I talked about before, that's sort of the thing that bridges between your compute nodes and the storage system, and funnels things down along the way. And several things can happen here. This one you really can't even control. These things are going to be happening for you no matter what you do. But for example, if many of your processes are opening a file that may get collapsed into a single open at a forwarding node, data may be aggregated into bigger chunks, and there can be caching there. And in fact, there almost certainly is some caching going on there. And it depends from system to system exactly what transformations you'll get there, but you have very little control over these, and they're going to happen. It's just sort of just part of the system. And there's also some not so transparent transformations that can be done. Things that can get even a little more aggressive in terms of how they're organizing data for the storage system. The things that I've talked about to this point, you do your reads and writes, and the file looks exactly the same on the storage system as it would have looked if you hadn't used any of those optimizations. It looks the same to the storage system, it looks the same to your application, but there's also some not quite as transparent things that still look the same from the application, but are going to make the data look wildly different to the storage system. And so one example is PLFS, the Parallel Log Structured File System. So the observation that they made in PLFS is that if we simply don't do concurrent access to any files, then there's not lock contention. So even if your application is trying to write a huge single file data set in parallel, PLFS does a transformation under the covers to map that into a lot of little files on the storage system. And there's a virtualization layer that sits on top of that and still makes it look like one big file like you would have had all along, but it's sort of redirecting the data to particular servers, to particular files, and organizing in even different order the data. So from the storage system's point of view, it looks like junk. It looks like a bunch of files that have no rhyme or reason to it. But when you use this abstraction layer, it looks like your same old files that you're used to. It can just get to the storage system a lot faster. So when you hear me say that part of the optimization in PLFS is that it's splitting things into separate files, that may make you think, well, why don't I just do that? I could write to a lot of different files myself without using something like this. Without some careful management, it can be a problem. And this isn't showing a performance result, but it's just kind of showing you trends on our systems. What we see is the red bar is applications that used one file per process, and the blue bar are applications that used MPI/IO. And at small scale, if you have a few thousand processes is small scale in this context, then that probably works reasonably well. Once you're getting up into hundreds of thousands of processes, it's a real problem because if you're just kind of blindly using that many files, you're going to have a lot of metadata overhead. The file system's going to be spending time managing the names of the files and opening and closing files and not actually moving your data. And not only that, it's a management problem for users because instead of having one nice data set or a few files that you're going to be moving around with Globus or something else, all of a sudden you've got millions of files that you have to organize yourself. So generally we don't advocate for people dumping an enormous number of files if they can help it. It's going to be a problem somewhere probably. Skip ahead just a little bit to talk about specifically systems at Argonne. Narrowing down further into a specific example, your data model library might be parallel net CDF. Your transformation library is likely MPIO, and CIOD is the forwarding software that's deployed on Mira, and GPFS is the storage system. So this is the exact stack that you will see a lot of times. You can swap out parallel net CDF for HDF and get similar results. And this is what it actually looks like on our hardware at Argonne. The compute nodes are several racks connected together with a torus network. There's 700,000 compute cores. We have a few hundred forwarding nodes that bridge to the storage system. There's InfiniBand that links those forwarding nodes to the actual servers. And the enterprise storage on the back end, let's see, what do we have? We have 32 storage arrays back there. Each of those has 560 normal drives and some small number of SSD drives. So this is sort of the scale that we're talking about. This is what you can actually use today in the exercises. So just to sum up, sort of what we've been through here. So the core of everything is in the HPC I/O ecosystem is the parallel file system, and most of what you'll hear us talking about is just trying to make the most of the parallel file system. We also have libraries that can help you translate scientific data models into something that's reasonable for the storage system, and those hopefully would save you a lot of work. You can do any of this stuff by hand, but there's no need to if you can help it. These sorts of libraries have been around for decades now. They're heavily tested and they're well accepted and have their own kind of community of tools and so forth. And from sort of a deployment and research perspective, we're always looking for ways to transform more efficiently from those data models to the storage system. And a lot of the places in that stack that we talked about, that's their kind of goal, is to organize data for you. And there's a lot of pieces, though. We went through a lot of parts of the architecture. Because there's so many moving parts in here, that makes it hard to debug. I'm not going to lie to you. You might do something that seems on paper like it would perform well. Maybe it doesn't. Later in the day, we're going to go through some tools that will help you figure that out so you can understand what's going on and why you're getting the behavior that you see.